Hi, I'm Brian from Simply Brian Enterprises, and welcome to my channel. I'm going to be launching a new playlist and a new series dedicated to topics related to the Raspberry Pi and electronics in general that may or may not have a connection to a particular lesson in the Top Tech Boy Raspberry Pi or Raspberry Pi Pico series. Not being afraid to shy away from a pun, when I thought of raspberry tartlets, I thought that's a great name. So this is my very first tartlet. And today we're going to be talking about the Raspberry Pi 400. If you're not familiar with the Raspberry Pi 400, the Raspberry Pi Foundation in about November of 2020 came out with this new concept. It is the inner workings of a Pi 4 integrated into a keyboard. Now, prior to the Pi 400, they already were producing a USB keyboard, and if you happen to have a Raspberry Pi branded USB keyboard, you'll notice that this is very similar. In fact, really the only difference is that the Pi 400 keyboard has a power button. Otherwise, this is really just a USB keyboard with a Raspberry Pi 4-like board inside. And when it came out, it was intriguing. I thought it was kind of an interesting looking thing, the all-in-one computer, kind of a throwback to the Atari, TI, Commodore, Amiga days of the 70s and 80s. And so that's kind of neat, kind of that nostalgia feel. But realistically, I couldn't think of a reason why I would want one. I couldn't think of a specific project or a specific feature about it that really made me want one. So I held off. Well, in 2021, we ended up in the chip shortage, and suddenly Raspberry Pi 4s went unavailable almost overnight. The supply dried up, and now they're very difficult to find at a reasonable price. But in the meantime, the Pi 400 was still readily available. It debuted with an MSRP of $70 US and continues today. The standalone Pi 400 is still $70 US. There's also a kit version available that includes the Pi 400, a Raspberry Pi branded USB mouse, which is the classic red and white Raspberry Pi colors, a Raspberry Pi branded power supply, a name brand micro SD card, a very handy micro HDMI to HDMI video cable, and this neat little book, the official Raspberry Pi Beginner's Guide with some Pi 400 information. Now, this book is mainly Pi 4, but it does talk about just a good cross section of all the things Pi, how to get up and running, format your SD card, install the OS, a little bit of Python, a little bit of Scratch programming. There's a free version of Minecraft that's available for the Raspberry Pi, so that's covered as well. Just a good cross section if you've purchased a Pi 400 and don't know what to do with it. A great book to get started. So the whole kit was $100 US, and I felt like that was a pretty good deal considering everything in the box. Um, so now, given that I can't buy a Pi 4, buying the whole kit for $100 seemed like a pretty good deal. This is hardware comparable to the Pi 4B 4 gig memory model. So we'll take a quick peek at what's all the connectivity on here. So we have the typical 40 pin GPIO interface. Excuse me while I drop it. Um, the downside to this is they're all recessed, so you definitely want to use the breakout cable and the little breadboard breakout thingy. There's the micro SD card, a pair of micro HDMIs, USB Type C, so pretty much like the Pi 4 at this point. Two USB 3.0 ports, one USB 2.0 port, and the Ethernet port. Now you may be wondering, why does a Pi 4 have four USB ports, but this one only has three? And the answer is simply because the keyboard is a USB keyboard and it's wired internally to one of the USB 2.0 ports. So there's only one available, which is okay because they still left the USB 3.0 ports available, which is what we most likely want. Now, the number one complaint that you'll see on forums and on videos of people talking about the Pi 400 is the missing headphone port. I don't know why the Raspberry Pi Foundation did not put a headphone port on here, but that is the number one complaint. Paul McWhorter made a mention of this at the start of the Pi class as well, that the Pi400 isn't ideal for the Pi class because it's missing the camera connector. And so I started to wonder, is the camera connector actually inside of it, but maybe just not exposed? And I have not pulled mine apart. I haven't had to, because there's several people on YouTube who've pulled theirs apart, documented it, and thanks to those people, I haven't had to tear the cover off mine. I have a good idea of what's inside. It is a custom made board. It does not carry over all the ports of the Pi 4, and it has no camera ports. So it's not like you can just pull the cover off or drill a hole and run the camera cable. The port does not exist in this model. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and plug this thing in and start using it a little bit, because there's a couple things I want to show you that are unique to the Pi400. So we're going to connect up the micro HDMI cable, and I'm going to plug in the mouse. So neat looking mouse. It's just a standard optical 2-button scroll mouse with the world's shortest mouse cord. It's literally 2 feet long, which does be kind of a problem, especially when you realize that the USB 2.0 port is all the way on the left side. So I have to plug in the mouse all the way on the left side. And if you're right-handed, like me and 90% of the world, that's kind of a struggle to use the mouse properly. And then as far as power goes, instead of using the USB brick, you're aware that in my shop here, my studio, I have my universal connector here supplying 5 volts of juice, plenty to run the Pi. And so I made a pigtail. I found this kind of fun rainbowy USB Type-C cable and chopped that up and put the connector on it. So that's what we're going to use for the Raspberry Pi power. And I thought that was kind of fun. So here we're going to go ahead and power this up and we'll watch it boot. And obviously I've already got an OS on it. I've got Bullseye 64 on the internal SD card. And we'll just come up here. Bear with me just a second as we boot. Thankfully it doesn't take too long. So far not really any different than watching a Pi 4 boot at all. And I'm going to log in and just saw my super secret password. So now you're going to break into my Pi400. And you can see just a generic desktop. I've got one of the standard background images. But I want to show you something that is unique to the Pi 4, the Pi 400, and I think the Pi 02. If you think about a PC that has a BIOS and it has those kind of like system board settings that don't change with the operating system, in the past, the Raspberry Pi has depended on a text file on the OS image to tell it different boot directives. Well, that's okay, but what if I want to run multiple operating systems? What if I want to have multiple micro SD cards or a USB stick or something? And so they've answered that problem by creating basically a small area of flash that holds now system-wide settings that are persistent between boots, between operating systems. So we're going to take a quick look at those. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to try to type this because I can barely see my screen. Sorry about that. Also, the keyboard's a little spongy. It's sometimes a little difficult to type. So I'm going to go into the Raspberry Pi configuration and I'm going to go into advanced options. And I'm going to go down to bootloader version. So this is going to, there's a couple options. That one's hard to read. So option 1 is latest, use the latest version. That's what we're going to do. So I'm going to click on that. Do I want to set it to defaults? Yes, we do, because I've learned that if you don't set it to defaults, it doesn't quite perform the update that we want it to update. So I'm going to go ahead and yes to update. And it says reset to defaults. That's great. We're going to come down here to finish. And you can go ahead and if you're wanting to do this on your own, you can go ahead and hit yes. I'm going to hit no because I want to see this output screen and see what it's doing. So we're taking this image file in lib firmware, Raspberry Pi, whatever, and notice it's dated 2023 January 11. So this is a fairly recent updated version of the bootloader. And you can see I'm already running the current version because obviously I've done this a few times. So my current version is already the latest. But if I was running an older one, like when I started, I think it was April 2022 or something was the current version. And then of course the updated was January 2023. And so now I'm going to go ahead and just do a reboot. And I'm going to pause the video so you don't have to watch that. And I'll be right back with you. Hey, just like that, we're back. All right. So we're back in, we've rebooted, and now I'm going to go back into Raspberry Pi configuration because I want to show you an option that we now have because we have that EEPROM, that flash area on the board, and we can actually set the boot order. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, by default, it's going to boot from the micro SD card and only the micro SD card. However, if I want to run multiple operating systems or use multiple environments, I may want to take something like a USB stick and install an image to it and boot from that instead of the micro SD card. But I don't want to take out the micro SD card because I still want to have my baseline operating system for managing my images and just doing, my basic things. If I boot it up without a USB attached, I still want it to boot into an operating system. So I'm going to choose option 2 here, which is USB boot, boot from USB if available, otherwise boot from SD card. So we're going to take that option. And once again, we're going to reboot. Now this time you're going to reboot with me because I want to show you something new that happens. This is a screen that you probably haven't seen before. And what it's doing right now is it's looking for a USB device, and if it doesn't find one, it's going to time out. This gives us a couple options. We can do a network boot from here. We can also see kind of a handy debugging screen. I haven't really seen much to do with this particular screen, but it's kind of neat that it gives you a little peek under the covers of what's going on. And so I'm going to let this boot up now. And instead of logging in, I'm going to actually reboot this again, but this time I'm going to insert a USB key. Oops, that's upside down. You can't read that. So this is a 64 gig stick that I have running an environment that I've called Pico because I'm going to be using this for the Pi Pico class. And so I'm going to plug that in. And I'm going to reboot once again. Oops, I think it actually powered it off, but that's okay. Then I can show you the power button. So it's the F10 key on the Pi400. Hold that down to power it back up. You see the typical rainbow screen. We'll see the Pi boot splash screen here in a second. Notice this time we didn't get that timeout screen because there's a USB device attached. And we boot up. And look at that, we have a different background. We have some items on the desktop. We are in a different environment. We're on a different operating system because this is booting off of the USB stick completely independent from the micro SD card. This is going to be really handy. As I mentioned in the Pi Pico class, I'm going to be using this for Pi Pico. I'll talk about more on that in another video and why I'm using the 400 for that. But now I have the ability to have, if I have multiple USB sticks, perhaps I have some different ones with different operating systems on them. Now I can kind of flip back and forth and just run the environment I want to run. I should make a point, these particular USB sticks, these are a name brand stick, USB 3.0, so these are a quality stick. But they did so much rounded surface on them that you can't really stick a label to them other than the underside where you can't read it when it's plugged in. So I found these multicolored tags, these kind of multicolored key tag things. So I've got, each stick is going to have a different color. And then of course I can write on it with a Sharpie or make a label for it to actually put writing on it. But for right now, having them color coded is really handy for being able to switch back and forth between environments. So I hope that gives you a little overview of the Pi400. It's a neat thing, but not necessarily one that I would make you buy. Well, if your name is Charlotte, I'll make you buy one, but I'm not going to make anyone else buy one. Um, I will tell you though, if you're interested in buying something like this, a Pi400, I would encourage you to take a look at one of the newer competitors that has come out. There's a company, it's a Chinese company called Orange Pi, and they came out with their own version of it and called it the Orange Pi 800. The difference is it's got a slightly faster processor, but if you look at the ports, they kind of solve some of the complaints people were having. So it's got the headphone port, it's got a full-size HDMI port, it's got a VGA port. The downside is it's got the older style 26-pin GPIO connector, so it doesn't have nearly as much GPIO as the Pi 4 or the Pi 400. But if you're looking for an all-in-one computer, it's an option. So I just want to say thank you for watching. If you like this video, be sure to hit like and subscribe below and keep an eye out. I'm going to have more raspberry tartlets along with a new Pi Pico series starting up. So thank you for watching. I'm Brian for Simply Brian Enterprises, and I'll see you later.